She spent her last $4 on coffee, unaware her blind date was a single dad who changed everything. Before we continue, please tell us where in the world are you tuning in from? We love seeing how far our stories travel. Kelsey Grant stood outside Rooted Coffee on Colfax Avenue in Denver on a Friday afternoon in early September, staring at her phone screen showing a bank balance of $4.37, and she was having a full-blown internal debate about whether showing up to this blind date was the dumbest decision she'd made all month or just tied for first place with agreeing to the date in the first place when her coworker Brittany wouldn't shut up about her boyfriend's friend who was super nice and totally her type. The problem wasn't that Kelsey didn't want to meet someone. The problem was that she was approximately 72 hours away from being evicted from her apartment, hadn't eaten anything except gas station instant ramen and stolen saltine crackers from the hospital break room in about 6 days. And the last $4.37 in her checking account was supposed to buy her enough food to make it to next Friday's paycheck, which was already spent 3 times over on her brother's rehab payments and the electric bill she'd been dodging for 2 months. Here's what nobody tells you about becoming your younger brother's only family after your parents die in a head-on collision on a 3 years ago. You don't get to have your own life anymore because every single dollar you make goes toward keeping another human being alive and sober. And Kelsey had been paying $800 a month for the last 8 months to keep Tyler in an outpatient addiction program after he'd nearly died from a fentanyl overdose in a King Soopers parking lot last January. She'd sold her car 4 months ago to cover 3 months of back payments, started taking the bus 2 hours each way to her ICU nursing shifts at Denver Health, picked up every overtime shift that existed until she was working 70 and 80-hour weeks. And she still couldn't keep her head above water financially. But at least her brother was 8 months sober and still breathing, which was more than she could say for half his friends from high school. Kelsey had tried to cancel this date 17 times in the last 3 days, had typed out messages to Brittany ranging from "I'm sick" to "I have to work" to just the honest truth, which was, "I literally cannot afford to buy myself a coffee right now, and I'm too humiliated to explain why." But every single time she deleted the message before sending it because the idea of admitting out loud that she was a 29-year-old ICU nurse who couldn't scrape together $10 felt like a failure she wasn't ready to name. So instead, she'd shown up wearing scrubs because they were clean and free, and she didn't have to explain why she wasn't dressed up. And she'd rehearsed exactly what she was going to order. Small drip coffee, $2.75. Nurse it for as long as humanly possible. Make an excuse about an early shift tomorrow, and get out before he suggested going anywhere that required actual money. She pushed open the door to Rooted Coffee and immediately spotted him sitting at a table by the window, looking exactly like Brittany had described. Tall with dark hair and brown eyes and the kind of tired face that said he worked too hard and slept too little. And when he looked up and made eye contact, Kelsey felt her stomach do something complicated that she absolutely did not have time for. Troy Vasquez stood up when she walked over and smiled in a way that seemed genuine and not like he was already calculating his exit strategy. "Kelsey? Hey, I'm Troy. It's really good to finally meet you. Brittany's been talking you up for like 2 weeks." His handshake was warm, and his voice had that slightly nervous quality that made Kelsey relax just a fraction, because at least she wasn't the only one who found first dates absolutely terrifying. They did that awkward dance toward the counter where you're trying to figure out if you're ordering together or separate, and Troy said something that made Kelsey's entire defense system activate. "What do you want? I'll grab it. My treat." Every fiber of Kelsey's being wanted to say yes, wanted to save her last $4, wanted to let someone else carry something for once in her life. But the pride that had kept her going through 3 years of financial nightmare kicked in hard. "Oh no, I got it. Thank you though. I'm just going to grab something small." And she stepped up to the counter before he could argue and ordered a small drip coffee and watched the barista ring it up. $2.75 plus tax, $3.01. And Kelsey handed over her $4 like it wasn't literally everything she had in the world and pocketed the change like it was no big deal. Troy ordered a plain black coffee, nothing fancy, and Kelsey assumed he was just one of those people who like simple things, had no idea he was doing the exact same math she was, trying to make this date happen on a budget that didn't exist. They grabbed their coffees and sat down at the table by the window, and for the first few minutes the conversation was standard first date stuff. Where'd you grow up? How long have you been in Denver? What do you do for work? And Kelsey explained she was an ICU nurse, which usually impressed people, but also made them weird about asking her out again because the hours were brutal and unpredictable. Troy's face lit up when she said, ICU. That's incredible. I can't even imagine the kind of stress that comes with that job. You're basically saving lives every shift. And Kelsey felt something warm spread through her chest because most guys either got intimidated or made jokes about asking for free medical advice. What about you? What do you do? Kelsey asked while wrapping both hands around her coffee cup to make it last longer. And Troy did this thing where his shoulders tensed up just slightly before he answered. I run a small startup, educational gaming apps for kids. We're trying to make learning accessible and fun, especially for kids who struggle with traditional classroom stuff. It's been a lot of trial and error, but we're getting there. He said it casual, but Kelsey heard the exhaustion underneath, recognized it because she'd been speaking that same language for 3 years. The language of people barely holding it together but smiling anyway. That sounds amazing. Are you making money yet? Or still in that startup nightmare phase where you're eating ramen and wondering if you made a huge mistake? Kelsey said it like a joke, but watched his reaction carefully. Troy laughed and it sounded relieved. Oh man, yeah, the ramen phase is extremely real. Some months are better than others, but I'm definitely not rolling in investor money or anything. Just trying to keep the lights on and build something good. Kelsey felt herself relax even more because, okay, so he wasn't some tech bro with unlimited money. He was just another person trying to survive in an economy that seemed designed to crush anyone who wasn't already rich. And suddenly this date felt less like a performance and more like two humans just talking. They ended up staying at that coffee shop for almost 2 hours, way longer than Kelsey had planned. And the conversation flowed in a way that felt rare and easy. They talked about weird hospital stories and the chaos of trying to build a business from scratch, about Denver's ridiculous cost of living and whether the mountains made up for it, about everything except the real stuff they were both carefully not saying. Somewhere around the 90-minute mark, Troy's phone buzzed and he glanced at it, and his whole face did something soft and complicated that Kelsey couldn't quite read. And when he looked back up at her, he seemed nervous in a new way. So I know this is forward for a first date, but would you maybe want to grab dinner sometime this week? Like actual food, I promise I'm not always this cheap. I just figured coffee was a good low-pressure start. Kelsey felt panic slam into her chest because dinner meant a restaurant and a bill, and splitting it would be at least 20 or 30 bucks she absolutely did not have. And her brain was racing through excuses that wouldn't make her sound uninterested when she was actually extremely interested. I'd love to, but my schedule's kind of insane right now. I'm picking up a ton of overtime, and I honestly don't know when I'd have time for a sit-down meal, Kelsey said, and hated how much of that was actually true. Hated that she was hiding poverty behind work obligations. Troy's face fell just slightly and then brightened like he'd had an idea. What about something more casual, like a walk around Cheeseman Park or City Park? No time commitment, no schedule stress. Just hang out if you have a free hour. Kelsey's brain did the math instantly. Walking was free, parks were free, she could absolutely do free, and suddenly she was nodding before she could overthink it. Yeah, okay, that actually sounds really nice. I could do that. Maybe Sunday afternoon if you're free. Troy's smile was genuine enough to make Kelsey's heart do something dangerous. Sunday works perfect. I'll text you details. And they exchanged numbers and stood up to leave. And Kelsey walked out of that coffee shop with $1.36 left to her name and a date with a guy who seemed to actually see her as a person instead of just a potential hookup or a resume to evaluate. She took the bus home to her apartment that had a pay or quit notice taped to the door, microwaved her last packet of ramen, and let herself believe for just a few minutes that maybe something good was allowed to happen, even when everything else was falling apart. What Kelsey didn't know was that Troy had driven straight home to relieve his babysitter and scoop up his 4-year-old daughter, who'd been asking all day when Daddy was coming back. And he was sitting on his couch that night, with Mia asleep on his chest thinking about the nurse with the sad eyes who'd spent money on coffee she clearly couldn't afford, and wondering if she'd run when she found out he had a kid. Sometimes the best love stories start with two people who are both barely surviving, both hiding their broken pieces, both terrified that honesty will scare the other person away. And sometimes those are exactly the people who end up saving each other. 3 weeks into seeing Troy Vasquez and Kelsey Grant had managed to build what looked like a perfectly normal dating relationship on the surface, except normal people went to restaurants and movies and did things that cost money, and Kelsey and Troy had perfected the art of free dates in a way that would have been romantic if it wasn't born out of mutual financial desperation. Neither one of them was willing to admit out loud. They'd walked every park in Denver at this point, Cheeseman and City Park and Washington Park, always meeting in public spaces during daylight hours, always keeping things casual and low-key, and Kelsey kept telling herself he was just respectful and not in a rush, while Troy kept telling himself she preferred simple dates and wasn't the type to expect fancy gestures. The truth was they were both completely broke and completely falling for each other and absolutely terrified to let the other person see the full reality of their lives. Kelsey's financial situation had gone from bad to catastrophic in those 3 weeks. She'd come home from her Sunday park date with Troy to find an official eviction notice taped to her apartment door, giving her 14 days to pay 2 months of back rent, totaling $2,600 or vacate the premises. And she'd stood there in the hallway of her building, reading that paper over and over, like the words might rearrange themselves into something less devastating. She picked up every available overtime shift at Denver Health, worked 4 16-hour doubles in a row until she was so exhausted she nearly gave a patient the wrong medication and had to be sent home by her charge nurse. And even with all those extra hours, she was still $1,200 short of what she needed because every paycheck had to cover Tyler's outpatient program and the payment plan she'd set up for his previous rehab stay and the electricity bill that was now 3 months overdue. Her brother had called her at 2 in the morning on a Tuesday, completely panicking because he'd been at a party where people were using, and he'd come so close to relapsing, he'd had to lock himself in someone's bathroom and call his sponsor, and Kelsey had stayed on the phone with him for 3 hours talking him down while she was supposed to be sleeping between shifts. I almost threw away 8 months Kels. I had the stuff in my hand. I wanted it so bad I couldn't breathe. Tyler's voice had been shaking so hard the words barely made it through the phone, and Kelsey had swallowed her own exhaustion and fear and said all the right things about how being scared meant he was still fighting, how calling instead of using meant he was choosing life, how she was proud of him for not giving up. She didn't tell him about the eviction notice or the fact that she was eating nothing but stolen hospital crackers and the occasional protein bar because she'd rather starve than take money away from keeping him alive. Meanwhile, Troy was dealing with his own crisis that he couldn't tell Kelsey about because he hadn't even told her Mia existed yet, and his 4-year-old daughter was starting to ask questions about why Daddy was on his phone smiling all the time, and who he was texting, and when she got to meet Daddy's friend. Troy had been a single father since Mia's mom. Olivia died 2 years ago from a brain aneurysm that came out of nowhere. She'd been picking Mia up from daycare one afternoon and collapsed in the parking lot and was gone before the ambulance even arrived. And Troy had spent the last 2 years figuring out how to be both parents while trying to keep his startup from completely failing. Every woman he'd dated since Olivia died had disappeared the second they found out he had a kid, either immediately ghosting him or sticking around for a few weeks before making excuses about not being ready for that kind of responsibility. And he'd learned to just not mention Mia until he was absolutely sure someone was serious. The problem was Troy was already serious about Kelsey, had been since that first coffee shop conversation. But every time he tried to bring up Mia, the words got stuck in his throat because what if this was the thing that made her run? What if she was one more person who saw his daughter as a deal breaker instead of the best part of his life? His startup had finally gotten a bite from a potential investor, small local educational foundation interested in licensing his phonics app for $30,000, which wasn't life-changing money, but it would keep his business alive for another year and let him actually pay himself something resembling a salary. They wanted to meet in person to discuss terms, and the meeting was scheduled for the same afternoon as Mia's preschool fall festival, the thing she'd been talking about nonstop for 3 weeks. And Troy sat in his home office staring at his calendar, trying to figure out how to be in two places at once. He chose Mia, sent an email asking to reschedule the investor meeting, and got back a response that was polite but firm. They were moving forward with another app developer who could meet their timeline. Thanks anyway. Troy read that email sitting in a tiny chair watching his daughter show him her painted pumpkin and felt his stomach drop through the floor because he'd just lost $30,000 and potentially his entire business future. But Mia was holding his hand and showing him her artwork, and he knew he'd make the same choice every single time, even if it financially destroyed him. That night after Mia was asleep, he texted Kelsey asking if she wanted to come over to his place that weekend instead of meeting at a park. And his hands were shaking when he hit send because this was it. This was him deciding to let her see his real life. Saturday afternoon, Kelsey took 2 buses to get to Troy's address in Englewood, a small single-family house with a yard that needed mowing and toys scattered across the porch, and she stood on the sidewalk staring at those toys, feeling ice water dump into her veins because, what the hell, he had a kid. He had a whole entire child he'd never mentioned in 3 weeks of dating. She almost turned around and left, but Troy opened the front door before she could move, and there was a little girl with dark curly hair peeking out from behind his legs, looking at Kelsey with huge, curious eyes. Kelsey, hey, come in. I need to talk to you about something. This is Mia. Mia, this is my friend Kelsey I told you about. And Troy's voice had that edge of panic, like he knew exactly how bad this looked. Kelsey walked into that house feeling like she'd been punched in the chest, and the second the door closed behind her, she turned on Troy with anger she didn't even know she'd been holding. You have a daughter. You've had a daughter this entire time, and you just didn't think that was worth mentioning. Were you ever going to tell me, or was I supposed to just figure it out? Her voice came out way louder than she meant, and Mia's face crumpled. And Troy immediately scooped her up and carried her to the living room, turned on cartoons, came back to the kitchen where Kelsey was standing, with her arms crossed, trying not to cry from sheer exhaustion and betrayal. I should have told you from the beginning. I know that. But every single woman I've dated in the last 2 years disappears the second they find out I'm a dad. They say they're not ready, or it's too complicated, or they just ghost completely. And I liked you so much I didn't want that to happen before you even gave me a chance. Troy's voice was shaking, and Kelsey could see he meant it, but that didn't make the hurt less sharp. You think you have it hard? The words exploded out of Kelsey before she could stop them. I'm about to be homeless, Troy. That $4 coffee I bought on our first date was literally the last money I had in my bank account. I've been eating stolen crackers from the hospital because I can't afford food. I sold my car to pay for my brother's rehab. I'm 2 days away from an eviction. And I've been lying to you about why I can only do free dates because I was too humiliated to admit I'm completely broke. The kitchen went silent except for the sound of cartoons playing in the other room, and Troy and Kelsey just stared at each other as the weight of what they'd both been hiding crashed down between them. Wait, you're getting evicted? Troy's voice came out hoarse. Kelsey, why didn't you tell me? I could have, I don't know, helped somehow. And Kelsey laughed, but it sounded broken. With what money? You just told me every woman leaves when they find out about your kid. You think I'm going to stick around if I admit I'm a financial disaster who can't even keep a roof over her own head? They both sank into chairs at his kitchen table, and the absurdity of it all hit them at the same time. They'd both been pretending to have their lives together when they were both barely surviving. Both so scared of being seen as too much or not enough that they'd been hiding their entire realities from each other. My startup just lost a $30,000 contract because I chose my daughter's preschool event over the investor meeting, Troy said quietly. I'm not doing well financially either. Some months I have to choose between paying myself or paying my developer. This house was my parents', and they let me stay here for cheap, or I'd be in your same situation. Kelsey looked at him, really looked, and saw the same exhaustion she carried, the same bone-deep tiredness that came from fighting every single day just to keep people you love alive and safe. My brother's 8 months sober, and it's cost me everything I have. My savings, my car, my apartment, apparently. But he's alive, and I'd do it all again. And Troy reached across the table and took her hand. That's how I feel about Mia. She's cost me every relationship and most of my business opportunities. But I'd choose her every single time. We're both just trying to keep the people we love safe. They sat there holding hands across his scratched-up kitchen table, and for the first time in 3 weeks they were actually seeing each other, Not the carefully curated versions they'd been performing, but the real messy, struggling humans underneath. Kelsey's phone rang and shattered the moment. Tyler's name on the screen. And when she answered, all she heard was sirens and someone saying, "Ma'am, your brother's being transported to Denver Health. You're listed as emergency contact. He overdosed about 20 minutes ago." The phone slipped out of Kelsey's hand and clattered on the table, and Troy caught it. And everything after that was a blur of him driving her to the hospital and staying with her in the ER waiting room while doctors worked on Tyler. And 4 hours later, a doctor came out and said he'd survive, but he needed inpatient rehab. 30 days minimum. 60 would be better. And Kelsey asked how much and felt the floor fall out from under her when they said 6,000 for 30 days. She walked out of that hospital at 2 in the morning, knowing exactly what she had to do. She was going to take the money she didn't have and figure out how to pay for Tyler's rehab. And that meant she was absolutely going to lose her apartment. Meant she'd be crashing on someone's couch or sleeping in her car, except she didn't have a car anymore. Meant her life was about to implode completely. Troy drove her back to his house because it was closer, and she was too numb to give directions anywhere else. And when they pulled into his driveway, she finally said out loud what she'd been thinking since the doctor gave them the numbers. "I'm choosing him. I know that makes me an idiot. I know I should save myself. But he's my baby brother, and he almost died tonight, and I can't let him go back out there without real help." Troy turned off the engine and looked at her in the darkness of his driveway. "You're not an idiot. You're someone who loves hard enough to sacrifice everything, and I'm not going anywhere. We're going to figure this out together, okay?" Kelsey wanted to believe him, but believing felt dangerous when everything she'd ever counted on had already fallen apart. Kelsey Grant got the official eviction notice on a Thursday morning, came home from a 12-hour shift at Denver Health to find all her stuff piled in the hallway and the locks changed, and she sat on the floor next to her garbage bags of belongings and laughed because honestly, what else was there to do when your entire life fit into 5 trash bags and you had nowhere to put them? She'd signed Tyler into the 30-day inpatient program 2 days after his overdose, worked out a payment plan with the rehab facility that was going to take her about 3 years to pay off, and accepted that saving her brother meant losing everything else, including the apartment she'd lived in for 4 years. Her coworker Brittany had offered her couch for a few nights, but Brittany had roommates and a studio apartment. There wasn't actually space for Kelsey long-term, and the reality of being a 29-year-old homeless ICU nurse was hitting her in waves that made it hard to breathe. Troy showed up at her old apartment building 30 minutes after she texted him a photo of her stuff in the hallway with the caption, "Well, this is happening." And he took one look at her sitting on the floor and didn't say anything, just started loading her trash bags into his truck. "You're staying with me. I have a spare room. It's Mia's playroom technically, but we can move her stuff. This isn't a discussion. You're not sleeping on the street." And his voice had that tone that meant arguing was pointless. So Kelsey let herself be helped for maybe the first time in 3 years, and it felt like giving up and being saved at the exact same time. They loaded everything she owned into his truck in 2 trips, and when they pulled up to his house in Englewood, Mia was waiting on the porch with a drawing she'd made that said, "Welcome home, Kelsey," in 4-year-old scribble. And Kelsey cried right there in the driveway because this kid didn't even really know her and was already offering more kindness than Kelsey knew what to do with. The spare room was small and filled with toys and a toddler bed shaped like a race car, and Troy spent that entire evening moving Mia's stuff into his room while Kelsey unpacked her 5 garbage bags and tried not to feel like a complete failure. "This is just temporary," she said when Troy brought her a pillow and some sheets. "I'll figure something out. Find a cheap room somewhere. I'm not going to invade your space long term." But Troy shook his head and sat down on the edge of the race car bed. "Stay as long as you need. Seriously, Mia already loves you. You're good company. And honestly, it's nice having another adult around who understands what it's like to be drowning. We can drown together, and at least it's less lonely." They set ground rules that night. She'd contribute what she could to groceries when she could. She'd help with Mia when Troy had work calls. This was roommates, not a relationship moving too fast. They were going to take this slow and do it right. Living together revealed everything they'd both been carefully hiding. Kelsey saw how Troy survived on 4 hours of sleep and black coffee, working on his apps after Mia went to bed, until 2 or 3 in the morning, saw how he made Mia elaborate breakfasts while eating nothing himself, saw how he chose her preschool tuition over fixing his truck that was making concerning noises. Troy saw how Kelsey worked 70-hour weeks and came home so exhausted she could barely stand, saw her eat rice and beans for dinner every single night because that's what she could afford, saw her on the phone with Tyler's rehab counselors and insurance companies fighting for every dollar of coverage. They fell into this rhythm that wasn't romantic but was intimate in ways that mattered more. She'd read to Mia at bedtime when Troy was on investor calls. He'd make her coffee in the morning before her early shifts. They'd sit on the couch after Mia was asleep and just exist in the same space without needing to perform for each other. 6 weeks into living together, Troy had a video call with the educational foundation that had originally rejected his app. Turned out the other developer had failed to deliver, and they were reconsidering. And Kelsey helped him prep his pitch, organized his demo materials, made him practice his presentation until he could do it in his sleep. She sat just off camera during the call and gave him thumbs up and encouraging faces. And when they offered him the $30,000 contract right there on the video chat, Troy's hands were shaking so hard he could barely type the follow-up email. "You did this," he said after he hung up. "I would have blown that presentation without you. This is your win too." And Kelsey felt something warm spread through her chest that had nothing to do with money and everything to do with being seen as valuable for more than just what she could sacrifice. Troy used part of that contract money to catch up on his own bills and pay himself an actual salary for the first time in 8 months. And then he did something that made Kelsey cry in the Safeway parking lot. He handed her an envelope with $1,500 cash and a printout showing a revised payment plan for Tyler's rehab that cut her monthly payments in half. "I called the facility and worked out a deal where I'd pay a lump sum if they'd reduce your overall debt. They agreed. This isn't charity, this is family helping family. You're not doing this alone anymore." Kelsey had tried to refuse, had said all the things about how she couldn't accept that kind of money, but Troy had been firm in a way that didn't leave room for argument. "You spent your last $4 on coffee because you were too proud to let me pay. I'm spending this money because I'm too stubborn to watch you destroy yourself. We're even." Mia started calling Kelsey Kels around month 3, would run to the door when Kelsey came home from shifts yelling, "Kels is home, Kels is home," and would drag her to the living room to show her whatever craft project they'd done that day. Kelsey taught Mia how to braid hair and paint nails, read her the same 3 picture books every single night until they both had them memorized, went to her preschool Christmas concert, and felt her heart grow in ways she didn't know were possible. One night after Mia was asleep, Troy found Kelsey crying on the couch. And when he asked what was wrong, she said, "I love her. I love your daughter like she's mine. And that terrifies me because what if this doesn't work out between us? What if I lose both of you? I can't survive that." Troy sat down next to her and took her hand. "I'm scared too, but Kels, I'm choosing this. I'm choosing you. We're not a temporary fix. We're building something real here. Do you feel it too?" Kelsey looked at this man who'd seen her at her absolute lowest and hadn't run, who'd given her a home when she had nothing, who'd helped carry her brother's addiction recovery like it was his own responsibility. And she nodded because, yeah, she felt it so deeply it scared her. "I haven't dated in years because I thought no one would want someone drowning in other people's problems," she said, and her voice cracked, and Troy pulled her closer. "I thought no one would want a struggling single dad who chooses his kid over everything. Turns out we're both idiots who assumed we had to be perfect to deserve love." They kissed for the first time that night on his worn-out couch with Mia's toys scattered around them, and it felt like coming home to a place Kelsey didn't know she'd been searching for. 6 months after Kelsey moved in, Troy asked her on a very official date, told her he had childcare arranged and he was taking her somewhere special, and Kelsey got dressed in actual nice clothes for the first time in forever. He drove her to Rooted Coffee, the same place they'd had their first date, and Kelsey laughed because, of course, he'd bring her back here. They ordered at the counter, and when the barista rang up 2 small drip coffees, Troy pulled out $4 in cash, exact change, and handed it to Kelsey with hands that were shaking slightly. "You spent your last $4 on me when you had absolutely nothing, when you were drowning and still showed up anyway, because you believed in possibility. And I want to spend the rest of my life showing you that belief was right. Kelsey Grant, will you marry me? He pulled a ring box out of his jacket pocket and got down on one knee right there in the coffee shop, and every single person in the place stopped what they were doing to watch. The ring wasn't expensive, simple silver band with a small stone, but it was perfect and real, and Kelsey was full on sobbing before she could even answer. Yes, oh my God, yes, I spent $4 I didn't have because some part of me knew you were worth it. And you've spent every day since proving that was the best investment I ever made. The coffee shop erupted in applause, and the barista gave them their drinks for free. And when they got back to the house, Mia was waiting with a sign that said, "Will you be my Kels forever?" in careful letters that Troy had clearly helped her write. And Kelsey scooped her up and said, "Forever and ever, I'm not going anywhere." They got married 4 months later at a community center in a ceremony that cost less than $1,000 but felt richer than anything money could buy. And Tyler walked Kelsey down the aisle 10 months sober and thriving, working as a peer counselor at the same rehab facility that had saved his life. Mia was the flower girl taking her job so seriously, she counted out exactly 3 petals per step. And Kelsey's vows were about how she'd thought she had to have everything together to deserve love. But Troy taught her that showing up broken and honest was enough. Troy's vows were about the $4 coffee and how sometimes the best things in life come from choosing connection over pride, from letting someone see your struggles instead of your highlight reel. The reception was potluck style with friends and family bringing dishes, no DJ, just a playlist on someone's phone, no fancy decorations, just string lights and paper lanterns, and it was perfect because it was real and built by a community of people who'd watched them both survive impossible things. Kelsey and Troy's first dance was to a song Mia had picked out, some Disney soundtrack that made everyone laugh, and they swayed together while their daughter ran around the dance floor with the other kids, completely joyful and safe. Sometimes love isn't about being stable or having your life figured out. Sometimes it's about 2 people who were both barely holding on, deciding to hold on to each other instead, about choosing vulnerability over pride, about building family from broken pieces and calling it beautiful anyway. If this story reminded you that you don't need to be perfect to be worthy of love, that your struggles don't disqualify you from happiness, that sometimes the last $4 you spend on hope is the best investment you'll ever make, go ahead and hit that subscribe button and share this with someone who needs to hear they're enough exactly as they are. Thanks for being here with us, and remember, the people worth keeping are the ones who see you drowning and jump in beside you instead of watching from the shore.